What's up, everybody? On today's video, we're going to talk about why the Florida Panhandle isn't part of Alabama. This has been a question on our channel that I'm looking forward to answer. We all understand that for the most part, most of the Florida Panhandle is culturally identical to Alabama. And in fact, the Florida Panhandle is referred to by a lot of people as Southern Alabama or Lower Alabama. So if it's culturally identical and geographically attached to Alabama, why is the Florida Panhandle still considered part of Florida? To understand that, we're going to have to take a little history lesson. The Spaniards were the first to arrive in North America from Europe, and by the 1500s, the Spaniards had settled Florida. In particular, St. Augustine was the first real settlement in North America. Unlike what the history classes teach in New England, that Jamestown was the first settlement, you need to understand that by the time Jamestown and the first quote-unquote Thanksgiving had taken place in that part of New England, the Spaniards already had grandchildren in Florida. The first Thanksgiving actually took place in St. Augustine, Florida, and historical records show that the first St. Patrick's Day was also celebrated in St. Augustine, Florida, because among the Spaniards that were mostly Catholics, there were Irish priests. The Spanish presence in Florida was really a pain in the butt to the English, and that was really Spain's intention in being in this area, even going as far as allowing African slaves to be free if they joined the Spanish army efforts. Fort Moses being the first African community of freed people in what would later become the United States with the assistance of Spaniards. And it's this rivalry between the English and the Spaniards that eventually leads to the current boundaries that we understand of being Florida. The Catholic religion was synonymous with the Spanish presence, and the Spaniards went out to set Spanish missions to convert the Native Americans, starting off in the eastern coast of Florida from St. Augustine to Jacksonville, heading westward towards the Tallahassee area and expanding into what is now the Florida Panhandle. And it's understanding that this region of the country from Jacksonville all the way to present-day Pensacola is really the heart of the Spanish presence in Florida. While we today look at Florida as perhaps Miami, Tampa, and Orlando, in reality, that stretch from St. Augustine to Pensacola is what was really the core of the Spanish presence in Florida. And understanding that that is the historical Florida makes you understand why that boundary goes so far to the west. While today, that's not the way we look at Florida. Back then, that path of missions along northern Florida is really the core of the Spanish occupation in Florida. And even there, the Spanish conquistadors at many times even had to eat their horses, since this area was very difficult to occupy. Even more difficult, the southern region of the state, where hurricanes knocked down trees and made passing the swamps impossible. Interjecting these territories would many times lead to the Spanish falling ill and losing their lives to things like pneumonia and other weather-related diseases. Respiratory problems took a toll on these first conquistadors, and that landscape was difficult to traverse. Therefore, once the Spanish had established themselves in this area, they really wanted to hold on to Florida. But it was more important for the Spaniards to hold on to Cuba because the land there was much more easy to cultivate and the weather much easier to deal with. Spaniards managed to obtain territory all the way as far as Baton Rouge. And in fact, to this day, as far as Baton Rouge, you're going to see street names and other cultural and historical things that point towards a Spanish presence, including towns in southern Louisiana that were clearly settled by the Spaniards. However, despite all that, the influence of the Spaniards even reached as far north as Charleston, South Carolina, and if you visit this town, you can definitely see cultural aspects of the Spaniards from Charleston all the way to Baton Rouge. With the Treaty of Paris, the Spaniards back out of Florida and the English take control of the state for a short period of time. However, the English were vastly inept to adapt to a landscape that even the Spaniards struggled to deal with, and the English presence was so weak that eventually Florida fell back onto Spanish hands during a time period where southern Alabama and southern Mississippi were not only referred to as West Florida, but despite the Treaty of Paris, was still disputed both by England and by Spain, which means that southern Mississippi and southern Alabama were in fact still disputed even after the treaty. Leaving this area known as West Florida, claimed by the United States with their English affiliates, and by Spain, and Spain obtaining a massive amount of empire that it was not able to hold on to. Even after Florida becomes under English control, the Spanish influence was very hard to remove from the people, and traits of Spanish culture remain present in the people and the culture of this area, from the food of the Spaniards to their music to parts of their religion and beliefs, and some of the work that the Spanish did in opening the path, being the first European explorers in Florida and Alabama. People like Hernando de Soto paved the way for the Spaniards, and now, even though this part of the country becomes English, becomes part of the United States, many of the cultural aspects of the Spaniards are still ingrained in the culture of the people in this region of the country, and it can still be visible today in the food, architecture, and many other aspects. Over all these changes of governments from the United States to England to the Spaniards and even the French, the line was drawn to where Florida, under Spanish control, and north of that, under English control, generally stood, which means that as Florida becomes a state, those geographical boundaries were to stay in place, forming what today is Florida, and leaving the Florida Panhandle to be considered part of Florida. And Florida could have even reached as far as Baton Rouge, stopping only short of the Mississippi River, where a stronger French influence would become prevalent. The geographical boundaries being the Apalachicola River, the Mississippi River, the 1763 boundary, and the 1764 boundary. This marked West Florida, and literally, if we were to go to that defining line, then in fact, Florida could be East Florida and West Florida today. Therefore, culturally, when you look at quote-unquote West Florida, which is basically the Florida Panhandle, southern Alabama, southern Mississippi, and part of Louisiana, this could all literally be one single state culturally. And if we were to reshape the boundaries of the states based off of culture, we could assume that southern Alabama, southern Mississippi, parts of Louisiana, the Florida Panhandle, and southern Georgia, extending into Charleston, South Carolina, is culturally an identical area. You can tell from their food, their architecture, and other similarities, both in the geography and the composition of the people, that in fact this could all be one long state because there's many attributes that they share in common. So for all practical purposes, yes, the Florida Panhandle could quite literally be part of Alabama. And the reasons why it's not stem not so much from our culture today, but from the geographical boundaries of the Apalachicola River, the Mississippi River, and other boundaries that were established in the mid-1700s that remain relevant today because of the treaties that were formed to make the United States is what it is today. The state flag of Alabama remains the Cross of Burgundy, which is a replica of the Spanish flag of Florida. That rivalry between the English and the Spaniards would almost guarantee that when the states are forged, they were going to dismantle as much of Spanish Florida as they could and make Florida be part of one single state that did not include West Florida. This fragmentation of the original Florida boundaries is just another reminder of the rivalries between the English and the Spanish and the battle for power that both of these powers had for a large period of centuries, with the English in the United States persistently wanting to grow their territory, while the Spanish, taking on more empire than they could handle, had to give up Florida. But even after the Spaniards gave up Florida, the Cuban Spaniards would continue to encroach upon English territory as the area of southern Florida was completely uninhabited and the English had no desire to be there because the weather, mosquitoes, and many other factors made it a very uncomfortable place to inhabit, being the reason why Spain had little intentions of holding on to Florida. The only real intentions that the Spaniards had with holding on to Florida was taking control of the Florida Atlantic coast because the Florida Straits, with its ocean currents, were the routes that the Spaniards needed to move the gold from South America back into Europe. However, Spain really just wanted to hold on to Florida as of a boundary towards the English and their encroachments, but nonetheless, the Spaniards had no real intentions of continuing to hold on to Florida for any real desire, which cannot be said about Cuba and Puerto Rico, places that the Spaniards hold on to dearly because this was the most secure route, easier places for them to dock their boats safely, with deep harbors like Havana, Santiago de Cuba, and San Juan in Puerto Rico. These were much more desirable places for the Spanish to hold on to. So while the English had a territorial claim for Florida, they weren't really able to inhabit the state. The Spaniards didn't really want to have a territorial claim over Florida, but it just was a strategic thing they wanted to hold on to. And with these differences, eventually Florida does become part of the English Empire and leaves behind the legacy of Spanish control. Even into the late 1800s and early 1900s, many people from southern Alabama went on to support the Spanish-American War. Therefore, they wanted to ensure that the Spanish control was completely eliminated from the Caribbean islands and that these nations like Cuba and Puerto Rico could have their independence. If you go to Wetumpka, Alabama, there's a cemetery there, and there's many people who have plaques of the Spanish-American War. Now you need to understand, a lot of people in Alabama have misplaced why the Spanish-American War was so important to those early Alabamians. Today, the narrative has completely changed, but to those people who took part in the Spanish-American War, it wasn't so much against Spanish people and their descendants. It wasn't really about hate towards the Spanish. It was against removing the power of the Spanish Empire, and thus, many of the people who fought for the Spanish-American War really wanted Cuba and Puerto Rico to become U.S. states. However, many people felt that just like the empires like the English and the Spanish before them that expanded their boundaries and were not able to control and hold on to their territories because they acquired more land than they could manage, they were afraid that the same thing would happen to the United States. Therefore, after the Spanish-American War, it was established that the goal was to help Cuba and Puerto Rico and other parts of Latin America free themselves from the powerful Spanish Empire. But these territories were left in question about what would happen to them because there was no real goal of making the United States into a quote-unquote empire like the English and the Spaniards. They really wanted the United States to consolidate itself and not become an empire taking over lands like the powerful forces before them. Therefore, even though there were efforts to remove the Spanish all the way up into the 1900s to remove that power vacuum of the Spanish Empire, leaving behind places like Latin America, where today they're independent countries that could have very easily been U.S. states. Many of the people in Cuba and Puerto Rico wanted to be part of the United States, but that legacy stood in place. And that is why Florida Panhandle, despite being so close to Alabama culturally today, remains part of the state of Florida and not West Florida or Alabama.